I want to play with a little model that I've been throwing around here with you all today. And what I'm positing is that the way to think about the last decade, starting in 2010, with how the Chinese government and military was stealing wholesale intellectual property theft from corporate networks, to our ending days in here in 2019, where the threat of the Russian government and military in the next election is looming in everyone's minds, and take those two bookends and look at those problems by dissecting it on three different levels. The first is about admitting there's a problem. The second is admiring that problem. And then the third part of this model is starting to solve for the problem. So admit there's a problem, admire it, and then start solving it. And I think that's the lens, the sort of three-part lens, that has shown us what we can start learning from the threats that we've been up against for this last decade. Let's start at the beginning. Let's start at China. Back in 2010, I think we had a quintessential Washington secret, something that a lot of people knew, and it was way too interesting to stay a secret. And it was this. It was that the Chinese military was stealing defense industrial base military secrets. There were uncanny pictures of F-35 fighter jets showing up in Chinese military parades that looked way too close to the actual F-35. There were traces of engineering plants that were out in the Midwest that were getting built, and they looked identical to what was getting built in China. There were these eerie signals that something was going on with the Chinese military, intellectual property theft, and no one quite had put the pieces together. And then on the other side, there were these IT departments that were looking at these remote access Trojans. Something called Shady Rat would come out. A paper would come out from a security company, and it dissected all the code in these different types of malware that were starting to hit corporate networks. And it looked complex, and it looked interesting, and data was going out the door, was getting exfiltrated. But no one had quite put this all together yet. And because of that, we couldn't quite figure out what this problem that Boeing was getting pulled into special meetings about, and Congress was curious about, and tons of people across the intelligence and security community were scratching their heads. Then we get to 2013. And the New York Times runs a piece about itself, about the New York Times. And in that January expose, the New York Times says the Chinese government has been hacking the New York Times reporters in China and getting information about their contacts and sources on the ground in China. Address books, calendars, emails. Now, the New York Times, as a paper, wants to put this out and doesn't feel too threatened in a way to tell their own news because, hey, they're a newspaper and they're trying to explain this, fine. That is the first time that we see this Chinese data theft in cyberspace combination starting to come out widely in public. Well, then a month later, and I was fortunate enough to be on the team that was part of this effort, a month later, in 2013, a report that detailed out how the Chinese military, a group called the PLA's Unit 61398, had been taking everything from steel alloy information to the blueprints of pharmaceuticals to green energy, IP, and R&D that had taken 15, 20, 25 years in many cases from the target. And that had been stolen with a set of internet infrastructure behind it that was laid out in excruciating detail in a report called APT-1, or Advanced Persistent Threat 1. And what that report did is it exposed these mechanics of how a cyber threat campaign worked. And it drew the line from these forensic data points all the way up to nation-state intent, the 5-year plan that the Chinese government had put out that aligned the areas of innovation and intellectual property that it needed in order to advance further. And it was that combination of understanding the geopolitical and economic needs of a country and lining up the forensics behind it that started to move us from admitting there was a problem and admiring it to being able to solve 4 pieces of it. And when we decided to release that report, we knew we needed to do that because we were in a position where we had 140 different companies who had been hacked. And at the time, the company was called Mandiant, it's now FireEye, but Mandiant had been doing these firefights, these incident response work at Fortune 500s, and was in a place where we could characterize the sources, the types of companies that were getting hit, but not go and expose the actual company. And no company in 2013, and no company likes doing it today, no company in 2013 wanted to come forward and explain, here's what's happened on my network, it's an existential threat, and all my IP just went out the door. Imagine what it would do to your stock price and your PR team's heart, right? So needless to say, this was a task that needed to happen, and we felt there was a duty to figure out how to expose what was a nation-state threat against corporations.